In the hallowed halls of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition echo through marble corridors and whispered secrets carry the weight of kingdoms, one moment can shift the course of history. Behind the gilded doors and velvet curtains, where protocol reigns supreme and every gesture is measured, the most powerful family in Britain was about to witness something that would shatter their carefully constructed world. What happens when a future king, bound by duty and drowning in expectation, makes a choice that defies everything the monarchy stands for? When love, loyalty, and legacy collide in a single breathtaking moment that leaves an entire room speechless. This is not just another royal tale of romance and rebellion. This is the story of how one unexpected decision sent shockwaves through the very foundations of the British crown, forever altering the relationships that hold the royal family together. The truth about that fateful day has remained hidden behind palace walls for too long. Until now, the morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as Charles Philip Arthur George, Prince of Wales, stared out of his private study window. His reflection showed a man carrying the weight of 74 years, each line on his face telling stories of duty, sacrifice, and dreams deferred. Today was different, though. Today, everything would change. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, its deep resonance filling the oak-paneled room. Charles had been awake since dawn, his mind racing with thoughts that had kept him restless for weeks. On his mahogany desk lay 3 documents that would alter the course of British royal history forever. The first was a formal invitation to the annual Commonwealth reception, where world leaders and dignitaries would gather to celebrate unity and tradition. The second was a private letter from his son William, expressing concerns about recent tensions within the family. The third was a handwritten note from Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, requesting an urgent private audience. Charles picked up Kate's letter, reading it for the 10th time that morning. Her elegant handwriting revealed nothing of the bombshell she was about to drop, but her request for absolute privacy spoke volumes. She had discovered something about Camilla that could destroy not just his marriage, but potentially his reign as king. The prince had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to separate his personal feelings from his royal duties. It was a skill learned through decades of public scrutiny, failed relationships, and the crushing weight of expectation. But, lately, cracks had begun to appear in his carefully constructed facade. The relationship with Camilla, once his source of strength and comfort, had become strained and distant. What had started as passionate love had evolved into something cold and transactional. Camilla Parker Bowles, now the Duchess of Cornwall, had been the great love of Charles's youth and the woman he eventually married after Diana's tragic death. Their love story, once scandalous, had been slowly accepted by the British public and the royal family. But acceptance and genuine happiness were 2 different things entirely. Charles found himself questioning whether their union was built on real compatibility or simply the stubborn determination to prove their critics wrong. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside made Charles straighten his shoulders and assume the posture of a future king. His private secretary, Michael Thompson, knocked softly before entering with the day's schedule. Michael had served the prince for nearly 15 years and could read his moods better than anyone. "Your Royal Highness," Michael began, his tone carefully neutral, "the Duchess of Cambridge has arrived for your 10 o'clock appointment. Shall I show her to the blue drawing room as requested?" Charles nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, and, Michael, ensure we are not disturbed. No exceptions." "Of course, sir. And the Duchess of Cornwall has inquired about joining you for lunch. She mentioned wanting to discuss the upcoming state dinner preparations." The mention of Camilla sent a flash of something between anger and disappointment across Charles's features. "Tell her I'll be occupied with Commonwealth matters all afternoon. We'll speak this evening." Michael recognized the tone and knew better than to ask questions. He had witnessed enough royal drama over the years to understand when discretion was paramount. After he left, Charles took several deep breaths, trying to center himself for what was to come. Kate Middleton entered the study with the grace and poise that had made her one of the most beloved members of the royal family. At 41, she had grown from the nervous young woman who had married William into a confident leader who understood both the power and responsibility of her position. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a navy blue dress that conveyed both respect and authority. "Uncle Charles," she said, using the informal address they had agreed upon years earlier when cameras weren't rolling. Her voice carried an unusual tension that immediately put him on alert. "Kate, please sit down. You sounded quite urgent in your note. Is everything all right with William and the children?" Kate settled into the leather chair across from his desk, her movements controlled despite the obvious anxiety radiating from her. "The family is fine, thank you. But what I need to discuss with you is far more serious than any personal matter." Charles leaned forward, studying her face. In all their years of family gatherings and official events, he had never seen Kate look so troubled. She was typically the picture of composure, the steady presence that grounded William and brought warmth to even the most formal occasions. "I've discovered something about Camilla," Kate began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that could change everything about your marriage and potentially your future as king." The words hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Charles felt his heart rate increase as dozens of possibilities raced through his mind. What could Kate have possibly discovered? Camilla's life had been thoroughly investigated years ago when their relationship became public. Every detail of her past had been scrutinized by the press and the palace security team. "Kate, I need you to be very specific about what you're suggesting," Charles said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used during official meetings. Kate reached into her handbag and withdrew a manila envelope sealed with red wax. The sight of it made Charles's stomach drop. Official palace documents were sealed in red wax, but this wasn't palace stationery. This was something else entirely. 3 weeks ago, I received a call from Lady Margaret Thornton. You remember her from the charity circuit? She's been involved with various causes for decades and has connections throughout London society. Charles nodded. Lady Margaret was a fixture at royal events, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory. Her family had served the crown in various capacities for generations. Lady Margaret asked to meet with me privately, which I found odd since we've never been particularly close. When we met, she told me she had been struggling with her conscience for months about information she possessed regarding Camilla. Kate's hands were trembling slightly as she broke the wax seal and withdrew several photographs and what appeared to be legal documents. She explained that her late husband, Lord Thornton, had been Camilla's father's business partner in the 1980s and 1990s. During that time, he kept detailed records of all their transactions and business dealings. Charles's mouth went dry. He remembered Lord Thornton vaguely as a successful businessman who had moved in the same circles as Camilla's family, but he had never paid much attention to the man's specific business interests. Kate spread the documents across the desk between them. Charles could see bank statements, correspondence, and photographs that appeared to be from decades ago. According to these documents, Camilla's family was involved in arms dealing during the height of several international conflicts. Not just any arms dealing, Uncle Charles. They were selling weapons to both sides of conflicts, profiting from civil wars in Africa and civil unrest in South America. The revelation hit Charles like a physical blow. He stared at the documents, trying to process what Kate was telling him. If this was true, if Camilla's family had been involved in illegal arms trading, it would be a scandal of unprecedented proportions. But that's not the worst part, Kate continued, her voice growing stronger as she realized Charles was taking her seriously. These documents show that Camilla was not just aware of her family's activities, she was actively involved in hiding the money trail. She helped launder the profits through various shell companies and charitable organizations. Charles felt the room spinning around him. This couldn't be true. Camilla had told him everything about her past, hadn't she? They had spent hours discussing their histories, their mistakes, their secrets. How could she have hidden something this enormous? "Kate, are you absolutely certain these documents are legitimate? This is an incredibly serious accusation." Kate nodded gravely. Lady Margaret had them authenticated by 3 different experts. The handwriting analysis confirms that several of the signatures are Camilla's from that time period. The bank records match with known accounts that were investigated by international authorities in the 1990s, but the investigation was quietly dropped after certain political pressures were applied. Charles stood up abruptly and walked back to the window, his mind reeling with the implications. If this information became public, it would destroy not just Camilla's reputation, but potentially his own credibility as future king. The British public had finally accepted his marriage to Camilla after years of viewing her as the other woman who had contributed to Diana's misery. This revelation would reignite all the old controversies and create entirely new ones. "There's more," Kate said quietly from behind him. Charles turned around slowly, dreading what else she might reveal. Some of the weapons that Camilla's family sold ended up being used in attacks against British peacekeeping forces. Soldiers died because of weapons that put money in her family's pockets. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles gripped the windowsill as the full weight of the revelations settled upon him. This wasn't just about business dealings or financial impropriety. This was about British lives lost, about betraying the very people they were sworn to serve and protect. "Why is Lady Margaret bringing this forward now?" Charles asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Her grandson recently joined the Royal Marines. She said she couldn't bear the thought of him potentially facing weapons that were sold by the same family that now holds such a prominent position in the monarchy. She feels she owes it to his memory of her husband and to the current servicemen to expose the truth. Charles returned to his desk and sat down heavily, staring at the evidence spread before him. Decades of Camilla's explanations about her family's wealth, their business connections, their social status, all of it suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. "What does Lady Margaret want in return for this information?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Nothing," Kate replied. "She's dying, Uncle Charles. Cancer. She has maybe 3 months left, and she wants to clear her conscience before she goes. She said she's lived with this knowledge for too long and can't take it to her grave." The authenticity of the motivation made the revelation even more devastating. This wasn't about money or revenge or political maneuvering. This was simply an old woman trying to do the right thing before her time ran out. Charles looked up at Kate, seeing his own anguish reflected in her eyes. "Does William know about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first. But, Uncle Charles, this information won't stay hidden forever. Lady Margaret has indicated that if nothing is done with what she's revealed, she'll feel compelled to take it to the press before she dies." The threat wasn't malicious, but it was real. Charles had perhaps weeks, maybe months, before this scandal exploded into public view. He needed to decide how to handle not just the information itself, but his relationship with Camilla and his future as king. "I need time to process this," Charles said finally. "Can you give me until the end of the week before we decide on next steps?" Kate nodded and began gathering the documents. "I'll keep these secure until then. But, Uncle Charles, you need to know that I support whatever decision you make. William and I both believe that the monarchy's integrity must come before personal considerations." After Kate left, Charles sat alone in his study for nearly 2 hours, staring at the space where the damning documents had been spread across his desk. The woman he had married, the woman he had fought for and defended for decades, had been living a lie that touched the very core of what the monarchy represented. The sound of Camilla's laughter echoing from somewhere in the castle halls made his stomach turn. How could she laugh and smile and carry on with royal duties knowing what she had done? How could she stand beside him at military ceremonies and charity events, knowing that her family's actions had contributed to the deaths of the very people they were there to honor? That evening, Charles canceled his dinner plans and ate alone in his private quarters. When Camilla knocked on his door to ask about his unusual behavior, he told her he was feeling unwell and needed rest. It wasn't entirely a lie. The weight of what he had learned was making him physically ill. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Charles realized that his entire world had shifted in the span of a single conversation. The woman sleeping in the adjoining room was not who he thought she was. The marriage he had fought so hard to make acceptable to the public and the royal family was built on a foundation of lies and blood money. Tomorrow, he would have to face Camilla across the breakfast table, knowing what he now knew. He would have to look into her eyes and decide whether to confront her immediately or wait until he had formulated a complete plan of action. But tonight, in the darkness of his bedroom, the future King of England allowed himself to grieve for the life he thought he had been living and the woman he thought he had married. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. Charles woke before dawn, his sleep having been fitful and filled with disturbing dreams where Diana's face morphed into accusations and Camilla's laughter echoed through empty corridors lined with weapons and bloodstained money. He dressed carefully in his favorite navy suit, the one Camilla had complimented him on just last week during a state function. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was preparing to potentially confront his wife while wearing clothes she had praised. Every small detail of their shared life together now felt tainted by what he had learned. Breakfast in the private dining room had always been one of Charles's favorite parts of the day. It was when he and Camilla could drop their public personas and simply be husband and wife, discussing plans, sharing observations, and enjoying the comfortable intimacy that had taken years to develop. This morning, however, the familiar routine felt like an elaborate charade. Camilla entered the dining room at precisely 8 o'clock, as was her custom. At 76, she maintained an elegant bearing that had only improved with age and royal training. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her makeup subtle but flawless, and her cream-colored blouse and pearls projected the image of refined respectability that had become her trademark. "Good morning, darling," she said, leaning down to kiss Charles's cheek as she had done thousands of times before. "You look better than you did last night. I was worried about you." The genuine concern in her voice made Charles's chest tighten with conflicting emotions. This was either the performance of a masterful deceiver or the authentic care of a woman who truly loved him. After yesterday's revelations, he could no longer tell the difference. "I'm feeling much better, thank you," Charles replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Just needed some rest." Camilla settled into her chair across from him and began her usual morning routine of scanning the Times while sipping Earl Grey tea. Her movements were graceful and familiar, the picture of aristocratic calm. Charles watched her carefully, searching for any signs of guilt, anxiety, or deception. He found nothing but the composed woman he had married. "The Commonwealth reception is tomorrow," Camilla mentioned without looking up from her newspaper. "I've reviewed the guest list with your secretary. Several heads of state will be attending, including some from African nations. I thought it might be wise to prepare some talking points about our recent charitable initiatives in those regions." The casual mention of African nations sent a chill down Charles's spine. According to the documents Kate had shown him, some of Camilla's family's illegal weapons had ended up fueling conflicts in Africa, contributing to the very instability that now required peacekeeping efforts and humanitarian aid. "Yes, of course," Charles managed to say, "though I may want to revise some of the talking points based on recent information I've received." Camilla looked up from her paper, her blue eyes showing mild curiosity. What sort of information? This was the moment Charles had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. He could confront her directly with what Kate had revealed, or he could continue to probe and see if she would reveal anything on her own. The investigative instincts he had developed over decades of royal duty told him to gather more information before making his move. "Historical context about some of the conflicts in regions where we're now providing aid," he said carefully. "It's important to understand how these situations developed if we're going to speak meaningfully about solutions." Camilla nodded approvingly. "That's very thoughtful of you. Your attention to historical detail has always been one of your strengths." The compliment felt like a knife twisting in his chest. How could she sit there praising his attention to detail while hiding such enormous secrets about her own history? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Morrison, Charles's senior advisor for Commonwealth affairs. James was a serious man in his 50s who had dedicated his career to understanding the complex relationships between Britain and its former colonies. "Your Royal Highness," James said with a formal bow, "I apologize for interrupting your breakfast, but we've received some unexpected news regarding tomorrow's reception." "What sort of news?" Charles asked, grateful for the distraction from his internal turmoil. "President Okafor from Nigeria has requested a private audience with you during the reception. His office sent a very formal diplomatic note indicating he wants to discuss matters of historical accountability and reparations." Charles felt his blood pressure rising. President Okafor was known for his direct approach to addressing colonial legacies and had been increasingly vocal about demanding acknowledgement of historical injustices. Did his office provide any specific details about what he wants to discuss? Camilla asked, her voice maintaining its usual diplomatic tone. James consulted his notes. The language was quite formal, but the implications seemed to center around British involvement in arms trading during several African conflicts in the 1980s and 1990s. He mentioned wanting to discuss how certain British connections may have prolonged suffering in his region. The timing of this request felt like a cosmic joke to Charles. Just as he was learning about Camilla's family's involvement in illegal arms dealing, he was being asked to account for British actions during the same time period. "I'll need detailed briefings on all British activities during those conflicts," Charles said. "Both official government actions and any private sector involvement that may have had governmental connections." "Of course, sir. Though I should mention that some of those records may be classified or politically sensitive." Camilla set down her teacup with unusual force, creating a sharp clink that made both men look at her. Surely President Okafor understands that historical business dealings, particularly private sector activities, are quite different from official government policy. There was something in her tone that made Charles study her face more carefully. Was that defensiveness he detected, or simply diplomatic caution? Nevertheless, Charles said, watching Camilla's reaction, we need to be prepared to address any concerns he might raise. Transparency and accountability are essential to maintaining Commonwealth relationships. Camilla's smile seemed slightly strained. Of course, darling. Though I do hope he's not planning to ambush you with accusations based on incomplete information. After James left to begin preparing the briefings, Charles and Camilla finished their breakfast in relative silence. The easy conversation that typically characterized their mornings had been replaced by a tension that neither of them acknowledged directly. As Camilla prepared to leave for her morning appointments, she paused at the door and turned back to Charles. Is everything all right, darling? You've seemed rather distant since yesterday. The question was delivered with apparent concern, but Charles detected something else underneath. Was she fishing for information about what might be troubling him? Just preparing mentally for tomorrow's reception, he replied. These international diplomatic events require careful consideration. Indeed they do, Camilla agreed. I do hope nothing unexpected comes up that might cause embarrassment for the crown. After she left, Charles sat alone at the breakfast table, replaying her words. The comment about embarrassment for the crown could have been innocent concern about the reception going smoothly, or it could have been something more pointed. Was she worried about what President Okafor might reveal? Did she know that her past was about to catch up with her? Charles spent the rest of the morning in his private office, ostensibly reviewing Commonwealth briefings, but actually trying to piece together a timeline of events. When had Camilla's family been involved in arms dealing? What specific conflicts had benefited from their weapons? How much money had they made? And where had it gone? The more he thought about it, the more questions arose. Camilla's family had always been wealthy, but their level of affluence had seemed to increase dramatically in the 1990s. At the time, Charles had assumed it was due to successful investments and business expansion. Now he wondered if it had been blood money from illegal weapons sales. Around noon, Charles received an unexpected visitor. Lady Margaret Thornton had arrived without an appointment, requesting just a few minutes of his time. Charles agreed to see her immediately, curious about what the dying woman might have to add to yesterday's revelations. Lady Margaret was smaller and more fragile than Charles had remembered. At 83, her battle with cancer was evident in her thin frame and pale complexion, but her eyes remained sharp and determined. Your Royal Highness, she said after the formal greetings were complete. I apologize for coming without advance notice, but I felt it necessary to speak with you directly after my conversation with the Duchess of Cambridge. Charles gestured for her to sit in the comfortable chair by the fireplace. Despite her physical frailty, Lady Margaret possessed a dignity that commanded respect. Kate mentioned that you had information about historical business matters, Charles said carefully. I have information about your wife's family's involvement in activities that resulted in the deaths of British soldiers, Lady Margaret replied with startling directness. My grandson will be deploying to regions that are still dealing with conflicts that were prolonged by weapons sold by the Parker Bowles family interests. The blunt statement left no room for diplomatic evasion. Charles appreciated her directness, even as it made his chest tighten with anxiety. These are very serious allegations, Lady Margaret. What specifically do you expect me to do with this information? I expect you to consider whether the British people deserve to know that their future queen consort profited from activities that led to British casualties, she replied. My husband kept meticulous records because he became uncomfortable with the business partnerships. When he tried to withdraw from certain deals, he was threatened. That's when he began documenting everything as insurance. Lady Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew a small key. This opens a safety deposit box at Barclays Bank in London. Box number 2847. Inside, you'll find the complete records of transactions, correspondence, and photographic evidence of meetings between your wife and various arms dealers. Charles stared at the key as if it were a loaded weapon. Taking it would mean committing himself to a path that could destroy his marriage and potentially his reign before it even began. Why are you trusting me with this? He asked. Because despite everything that's been written about your personal life, I believe you are fundamentally an honorable man who will do what's right for Britain, Lady Margaret replied. And because I'm dying, and I need to know that the truth will be revealed one way or another. Charles took the key, feeling its weight despite its small size. How long do I have before this information becomes public regardless of my decision? I've written letters to be opened upon my death if no action has been taken, Lady Margaret said. My doctors give me perhaps 6 weeks. But Your Royal Highness, this isn't about threats or deadlines. This is about whether the crown will stand for justice or continue to protect those who have betrayed everything it represents. After Lady Margaret left, Charles sat staring at the key for nearly an hour. The safety deposit box contained either the complete destruction of his personal happiness or the salvation of his conscience and his duty to the crown. That afternoon, Charles made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. He called Kate and asked her to arrange a completely private meeting with William. No secretaries, no advisors, no official record. Just the three of them discussing the future of the monarchy. When William arrived that evening, his expression was serious but calm. At 41, the Duke of Cambridge had grown into a thoughtful leader who understood both the privileges and responsibilities of his position. His relationship with his father had improved dramatically over the years, particularly after they had worked through their different perspectives on duty versus personal happiness. Kate briefed me on the situation, William said without preamble after the three of them were settled in Charles's private study. I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have my complete support. The simple statement of loyalty brought unexpected tears to Charles's eyes. For years, he had worried about how his relationship with Camilla might affect his relationship with his sons. Now, in his moment of greatest crisis, William was offering unconditional support. This could destroy everything, Charles said quietly. My marriage, my reputation, potentially the monarchy's standing with the Commonwealth. Or it could save the monarchy's integrity, Kate replied gently. Uncle Charles, the crown has survived scandals before, but it's never survived being on the wrong side of justice. William nodded in agreement. The question isn't whether this information will eventually come to light. Lady Margaret's death will trigger the release of those letters regardless. The question is whether the royal family will be seen as complicit in covering up the truth or courageous enough to confront it. Charles looked at his son and daughter-in-law, these two people who represented the future of the institution he would one day lead. Their moral clarity in the face of such a complex situation both impressed and humbled him. There's something else you both need to know, Charles said. He told them about President Okafor's request for a private meeting and the timing of his questions about British involvement in arms dealing during the relevant time period. It's possible that other world leaders already know about Camilla's family connections, William observed. If that's the case, then we're not just dealing with potential future exposure. We may be dealing with immediate diplomatic consequences. The three of them spent the next 2 hours developing a preliminary plan of action. Charles would confront Camilla directly and give her an opportunity to explain or deny the allegations. Depending on her response, they would then decide whether to involve legal counsel, palace security, or proceed directly to damage control. As William and Kate prepared to leave, Charles felt both terrified and relieved. For the first time since learning about Camilla's secrets, he was not facing the crisis alone. Whatever happens tomorrow, William said as he embraced his father, remember that doing the right thing is never the wrong choice. Charles spent that night preparing for what might be the most difficult conversation of his life. Tomorrow, he would face his wife with evidence of betrayals that went to the very core of everything they both claimed to represent. The morning of the Commonwealth reception dawned gray and foreboding, with heavy clouds hanging over Windsor Castle like an omen of the storm about to break. Charles had barely slept, spending most of the night rehearsing different approaches to confronting Camilla while dreading each possible outcome. He had decided to speak with her immediately after breakfast, before the day's official duties began and while they still had privacy. The confrontation needed to happen before she appeared at his side during the reception, before he had to watch her smile and shake hands with world leaders while knowing what he now knew about her past. Camilla entered the breakfast room precisely on schedule, looking impeccable as always in a soft blue dress that complemented her eyes. Her demeanor was cheerful and relaxed, showing no signs of the anxiety that was consuming Charles. She kissed his cheek with genuine warmth and settled into her chair with the comfortable ease of a woman who had no reason to suspect that her world was about to crumble. I've been thinking about our conversation with President Okafor today, she said while pouring her tea. Perhaps we should emphasize Britain's current peacekeeping efforts rather than dwelling on past conflicts. Sometimes it's better to focus on solutions rather than problems. The irony of her words struck Charles like a physical blow. Here she was, advocating for avoiding discussion of past conflicts while hiding her own family's role in perpetuating those very conflicts. Camilla, Charles said, his voice unusually formal. We need to discuss something important before today's events begin. She looked up from her newspaper, immediately sensing the gravity in his tone. Of course, darling. What's troubling you? Charles reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the manila envelope Kate had given him, along with the small key from Lady Margaret. He placed both items on the table between them, watching carefully for any reaction. Camilla's eyes fixed on the envelope and key, and for just a moment, Charles saw something flicker across her face. Fear? Recognition? Guilt? It was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. But he didn't think so. What are these? She asked, her voice carefully controlled. Documents and evidence relating to your family's business activities in the 1980s and 1990s, Charles replied, studying her face intently. Specifically, their involvement in international arms dealing. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Camilla's face went through a series of subtle changes, expressions shifting so quickly that Charles could barely track them. Surprise, calculation, defiance, and, finally, a kind of resigned sadness. Who gave you this information? She asked finally. That's not the relevant question, Charles replied. The relevant question is whether it's true. Camilla set down her teacup with deliberate care and folded her hands in her lap. When she looked up at Charles, her expression was completely different from the woman who had entered the room just minutes earlier. The mask of cheerful domesticity had been replaced by something harder and more calculating. What exactly do you think you know? She asked. I know that your family sold weapons to multiple sides of various conflicts, prolonging wars and contributing to casualties among British peacekeeping forces, Charles said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. I know that you were personally involved in laundering the profits through shell companies and fake charitable organizations. I know that you've been lying to me about your past for our entire relationship. Camilla's composure cracked slightly, a flash of anger crossing her features before she regained control. You know what someone wants you to believe based on documents that could have been fabricated or taken out of context. Are you denying that any of it happened? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Charles realized he was holding his breath, hoping against hope that she would provide some explanation that would make this nightmare go away. I'm saying that the world is more complicated than you seem to understand, Camilla replied. Business dealings from decades ago, conducted by family members, don't necessarily reflect personal involvement or moral culpability. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't even close to a denial. It was a lawyer's answer, carefully crafted to avoid admitting guilt while not quite lying outright. Your signature is on financial documents authorizing the movement of funds, Charles said, opening the envelope and spreading some of the evidence across the table. These aren't just family business dealings. These are your personal transactions. Camilla glanced at the documents, but didn't pick them up or examine them closely. Her lack of surprise at seeing them confirmed Charles's worst fears. She had been expecting this moment for years, perhaps decades. Charles, she said, her voice taking on a tone he had never heard before. It was cold, almost predatory. Do you have any idea what your precious royal family was doing during those same years? Do you think the crown's hands are clean when it comes to international arms dealing and political manipulation? The deflection felt like a slap across the face. This isn't about the crown's historical actions. This is about you lying to me about who you are and what you've done. I never lied to you, Camilla replied sharply. I simply didn't burden you with information about business activities that were concluded before we were married. Business activities that, I might add, were perfectly legal at the time they were conducted. Legal? Charles's voice rose despite his efforts to maintain control. Selling weapons to both sides of civil wars was legal? Laundering money through fake charities was legal? Contributing to conflicts that killed British soldiers was legal? The arms trade is a complex business with complex international regulations, Camilla replied, her tone becoming more defensive. Many activities that seemed questionable in retrospect were conducted within the bounds of existing laws and regulations. Charles stood up abruptly, beginning to pace behind his chair. The woman sitting across from him bore little resemblance to the Camilla he thought he had married. This person was cold, calculating, and completely unrepentant about activities that had caused immense human suffering. Do you have any remorse at all? He asked. Any regret about the consequences of what your family did? Regret about successfully building wealth that has supported numerous legitimate charitable causes over the years? Camilla replied. Regret about business activities that were conducted by adults making informed decisions? No, Charles, I don't have regret about things that happened decades ago. The casual dismissal of human suffering as mere business activities crystallized something in Charles's mind. This wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with. Either she had been masterfully deceiving him for years, or the stress of being exposed had revealed her true nature. What about the British soldiers who died? Charles asked quietly. Do you feel any responsibility for their deaths? That's an absurd connection to make, Camilla replied, though Charles noticed her voice was less steady than before. Weapons sold in legal transactions cannot be held responsible for every subsequent use by every subsequent owner. The documents show that your family specifically sought out conflicts where they could sell to multiple sides, Charles said, picking up one of the papers. This wasn't passive arms dealing. This was actively prolonging wars for profit. Camilla finally stood up, her composure beginning to crack more visibly. Charles, you're being manipulated by people who want to destroy our marriage and undermine your future as king. Can't you see that? This information is being released now, just as you're about to ascend to the throne, because someone wants to damage the monarchy. The information is being released now because Lady Margaret Thornton is dying and wants to clear her conscience before she goes, Charles replied. She's not seeking money or political advantage. She's seeking justice for her grandson, who is about to deploy to regions that are still suffering from conflicts your family helped perpetuate. The mention of Lady Margaret's name caused a visible change in Camilla's expression. The calculated defensiveness was replaced by something that looked almost like panic. Margaret Thornton is a bitter old woman whose husband was bitter about being excluded from certain business opportunities, Camilla said quickly. She's been carrying a grudge for decades, and now she's trying to take revenge. By fabricating bank records? By forging your signature on legal documents? By creating fake photographs of meetings that never happened? Charles shook his head. Camilla, the evidence is overwhelming. The question isn't whether you did these things. The question is what we're going to do about it now. Camilla sat back down heavily, and for a moment she looked every one of her 76 years. The mask of royal composure had slipped completely, revealing a woman who was cornered and running out of options. What do you want me to say, Charles? She asked, her voice suddenly quiet and tired. Do you want me to prostrate myself and beg forgiveness for things that happened in a different lifetime? Do you want me to destroy myself publicly to satisfy your sudden attack of moral righteousness? The bitterness in her tone cut through Charles like a knife. This was her response to being confronted with evidence that her actions had contributed to the deaths of British soldiers? Sarcasm and self-pity? I want you to show some acknowledgement that what you did was wrong, Charles said. I want you to demonstrate some understanding of how your actions affected innocent people. I want you to behave like the woman I thought I married. The woman you thought you married was a fantasy, Camilla replied with brutal honesty. You married a real person with a real past, including business dealings that were necessary for survival in a complex world. If you preferred fantasy, you should have stayed with Diana. The mention of Diana was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Charles felt decades of carefully controlled emotions threatening to explode. Don't you dare bring Diana into this, he said, his voice dangerously low. Diana never profited from the deaths of British soldiers. Diana never laundered blood money through fake charities. Diana never lied about who she was or what she had done. Diana was naive, Camilla shot back. She lived in a fairy tale world where she could afford to be pure and innocent because she never had to make hard choices about survival and success. Charles stared at his wife in complete shock. The casual cruelty of her dismissal of Diana, combined with her complete lack of remorse for her own actions, revealed a side of Camilla he had never seen before. You're going to have to choose, Camilla continued, her voice becoming harder. You can destroy our marriage and damage your reign based on 30-year-old business dealings that have no relevance to our current lives, or you can remember that the monarchy has survived much worse scandals by simply refusing to dignify accusations with responses. The ultimatum was delivered with cold calculation, as if she were negotiating a business deal rather than trying to save her marriage. Charles realized that she wasn't asking for forgiveness or understanding. She was demanding that he become complicit in covering up her crimes. There's going to be a third option, Charles said quietly. One that doesn't require me to choose between truth and loyalty. What are you talking about? President Okafor is going to ask me about British involvement in arms dealing today, Charles replied. Other world leaders may already know about your family's activities. The information is going to come out whether we control it or not. The only question is whether the royal family will be seen as transparent and accountable, or as complicit in a cover-up. Camilla's face went pale. You wouldn't dare expose this publicly. I wouldn't dare continue to cover it up, Charles corrected. The integrity of the crown is more important than any individual, including you and including me. If you expose this, it will destroy everything we've built together, Camilla said, desperation creeping into her voice for the first time. Our marriage, your relationship with the public, your credibility as a future king. Everything will be ruined. Charles looked at the woman he had once loved more than life itself, the woman he had given up so much for, the woman he had defended against public criticism for decades. She was still beautiful, still elegant, still carrying herself with the poise of a duchess. But she was also revealed as someone who valued her own comfort and status more than human life or moral principle. Some things are more important than our personal happiness, Charles said finally. The truth is one of those things. Justice for the families of the soldiers who died is another. You're making a terrible mistake, Camilla warned. This will backfire on you in ways you can't imagine. Perhaps, Charles agreed. But living with the knowledge of what you did while pretending nothing has changed would be a worse mistake. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside signaled that their private time was ending. Soon, staff members would arrive to begin preparations for the day's official events. Charles and Camilla would have to decide how to proceed. I need some time to think about this, Camilla said, standing up and smoothing her dress. We can't resolve everything in one conversation. Time to think about what? Charles asked. About how to explain your actions, or about how to continue covering them up. Time to think about whether our marriage can survive your apparent determination to destroy it, Camilla replied coldly. She gathered her composure and walked toward the door, pausing just before she reached it. Charles, if you go through with exposing this information, there will be consequences you haven't considered. I'm not the only person with secrets. The royal family has vulnerabilities that certain people would be very happy to exploit if they felt cornered. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Camilla was suggesting that if Charles exposed her secrets, she might be willing to reveal damaging information about other members of the royal family. Is that a threat? Charles asked. It's a reality check, Camilla replied. Actions have consequences. Sometimes those consequences affect innocent people who don't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. After she left, Charles sat alone in the breakfast room, staring at the evidence spread across the table. In the space of 30 minutes, his marriage had effectively ended and his future as king had become infinitely more complicated. But, for the first time since learning about Camilla's secrets, he felt a sense of clarity about what needed to be done. The Commonwealth reception that afternoon would be the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where truth and integrity would take precedence over personal comfort and public image. The only question now was whether he would have the courage to follow through when the moment of choice arrived. The grand reception hall at Buckingham Palace had been transformed into a diplomatic showcase, with flags from 54 Commonwealth nations hanging majestically from the ornate ceiling. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the assembled heads of state, dignitaries, and their entourages, all dressed in their finest formal attire. The scene looked like something from a fairy tale, but Charles felt as if he were walking into a nightmare. He stood at the entrance to the hall, wearing his full ceremonial uniform with its array of medals and decorations. To the outside world, he appeared every inch the future king, composed and regal. Inside, his heart was pounding with the knowledge that everything was about to change. Camilla stood beside him in an elegant navy blue gown with the Cambridge lover's knot tiara sparkling in her hair. She had chosen her most formal jewelry and carried herself with perfect royal bearing. To anyone watching, they appeared to be the picture of a unified royal couple. Only Charles could see the tension in her shoulders and the slight strain around her eyes. They had not spoken since their devastating conversation that morning. Camilla had spent the day in her private chambers, emerging only 20 minutes before the reception began. When she appeared, she looked immaculate and composed, giving no hint of the accusations that had torn their marriage apart just hours earlier. Your Royal Highness, announced the Master of Ceremonies, President Okafor of Nigeria. Charles took a deep breath as President Okafor approached. The Nigerian leader was a tall, dignified man in his 60s with intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had built his political career on fighting corruption and demanding accountability from both domestic and international actors. President Okafor, Charles said, extending his hand. Welcome to London. I understand you requested a private audience this evening. Indeed I did, Your Royal Highness, President Okafor replied, his handshake firm and his gaze steady. There are matters of historical importance that I believe require discussion between our nations. Charles felt Camilla stiffen slightly beside him, though her smile never wavered. I look forward to our conversation, Charles replied. Shall we arrange to meet in the blue drawing room in an hour? That would be most appropriate, President Okafor agreed. His eyes shifted briefly to Camilla, and Charles caught a flicker of something that might have been recognition before the president moved on to greet other officials. As the evening progressed, Charles found himself studying the faces of various Commonwealth leaders, wondering how many of them might already know about Camilla's family's activities. Several seemed unusually formal in their interactions with him, their diplomatic smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Prime Minister Camilla of Kenya was particularly cool in her greeting, her conversation limited to the bare minimum of diplomatic courtesy. When Charles mentioned their shared commitment to peace in the region, she replied with pointed remarks about the importance of accountability for those who had prolonged conflicts through illegal arms trading. The pattern continued throughout the reception. Leaders from several African nations seemed to be delivering subtle messages about historical injustices and the need for truth and reconciliation. Charles began to realize that Lady Margaret's information might not be the secret he had assumed it was. Other people clearly knew about Camilla's past, and they were waiting to see how he would respond. During a brief lull in the formal greetings, Kate approached Charles discreetly. She looked stunning in an emerald green gown, but her expression was troubled. "Uncle Charles," she said quietly, "William and I have been monitoring the conversations tonight. Several leaders have made very pointed comments about arms dealing and accountability. I think they may be testing whether you're aware of certain information." Charles nodded grimly. President Okafor isn't the only one who wants to discuss historical issues. This feels like a coordinated effort to bring these matters into the open. "Where is Camilla?" Kate asked, glancing around the room. "Speaking with the Australian delegation," Charles replied, indicating the far corner where Camilla was engaged in animated conversation with Prime Minister Henderson. "She's been avoiding the African leaders all evening." As if sensing their attention, Camilla looked up and caught Charles's eye across the crowded room. For a moment, their gazes held, and Charles saw something that looked like a plea in her expression. She was asking him to protect her, to maintain their united front despite everything that had been revealed. The moment was broken by the approach of President Okafor, who touched Charles's elbow gently. "Your Royal Highness, I believe our scheduled time has arrived." Charles excused himself from Kate and followed President Okafor toward the blue drawing room. As they walked through the palace corridors, away from the noise and pageantry of the reception, Charles felt as if he were walking toward his destiny. The blue drawing room was one of Charles's favorites in the palace, with its elegant 18th-century decor and portraits of previous monarchs looking down from the walls. Under normal circumstances, it was a room that conveyed continuity and tradition. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom. President Okafor settled into one of the ornate chairs and regarded Charles with an expression that was both respectful and unwavering. "Your Royal Highness, I want to begin by saying that I have tremendous respect for your personal character and your commitment to the Commonwealth. What I need to discuss with you tonight is not about you personally, but about information that has come to my government's attention." Charles took a deep breath. "I appreciate your directness, President Okafor. Please, speak freely. My government has been investigating the sources of weapons that prolonged several conflicts in our region during the 1980s and 1990s, President Okafor began. "Our investigation has identified a network of British arms dealers who sold weapons to multiple sides of various civil wars, significantly extending the duration and casualty rates of those conflicts." Charles felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained eye contact with the president. "During our investigation, we discovered that one of the central figures in this network had family connections to your wife, the Duchess of Cornwall," President Okafor continued. "More significantly, we found evidence suggesting that the Duchess herself was personally involved in laundering the profits from these sales." The words hung in the air between them. Charles realized that this was the moment of truth, not just for his marriage or his personal integrity, but for the entire future of the monarchy's relationship with the Commonwealth. "President Okafor," Charles said slowly, "what exactly are you asking of me?" "I am asking whether the British Crown is prepared to acknowledge this historical injustice and work with our governments to provide accountability and reparations for the damage caused," President Okafor replied. "Or whether the Crown intends to protect individuals who profited from African suffering." Charles felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Camilla anymore. This was about whether the monarchy would choose truth and justice over personal loyalty and institutional protection. "If I were to tell you that I only learned of these allegations very recently, and that I am still processing the full implications. Would you be willing to work with me to address them appropriately? Charles asked. President Okafor's expression softened slightly. Your Royal Highness, if you are willing to pursue truth and accountability, regardless of personal cost, then Nigeria and our allied nations are prepared to work with you constructively. But if the Crown chooses to cover up or ignore these crimes, we will be forced to pursue other avenues for justice. What sort of other avenues? International courts, public tribunals, economic sanctions against individuals, and institutions that benefited from blood money. President Okafor replied matter-of-factly. We have been patient for decades, hoping that truth would eventually emerge through proper channels. That patience is not unlimited. Charles understood the implicit threat. If he didn't handle this situation properly, it could result in international legal action that would be far more damaging to the monarchy than voluntary disclosure and accountability. I need you to know that I am committed to doing what is right, Charles said. But I also need time to gather complete information and develop an appropriate response. These allegations involve legal complexities and family relationships that require careful consideration. How much time do you need? 2 weeks, Charles said, making a decision that surprised even himself. Give me 2 weeks to investigate fully and develop a comprehensive plan for addressing these issues. President Okafor studied Charles's face carefully before nodding. 2 weeks is acceptable, provided you understand that this matter cannot be buried or delayed indefinitely. The families of those who died deserve justice, and the people of Africa deserve to know the truth about who profited from their suffering. As they prepared to return to the reception, President Okafor paused. Your Royal Highness, may I speak candidly about a personal matter? Charles nodded. I have followed your life story for many years, and I have always admired your commitment to duty over personal preference. Tonight, you face perhaps the greatest test of that commitment. I hope you will remember that true leadership requires the courage to do what is right, even when it costs us everything we hold dear. The two men returned to the reception, where the evening continued with its carefully choreographed diplomatic conversations. But Charles felt as if he were moving through a dream. Everything looked the same, but everything had fundamentally changed. Camilla approached him as the evening was winding down, her public smile still perfectly in place. How did your conversation go with President Okafor? She asked quietly. We discussed historical accountability and truth, Charles replied, watching her face carefully. And what did you tell him? I told him that I am committed to doing what is right, Charles said. I gave him my word that this matter will be addressed properly within 2 weeks. Camilla's face went pale beneath her makeup. Charles, you cannot be serious about exposing this publicly. Think about what it will do to your reputation, to your relationships with other world leaders, to your future as king. I've thought about all of those things, Charles replied. But I've also thought about the soldiers who died because of weapons your family sold, and the families who deserve to know the truth about why their loved ones never came home. You're destroying everything we've built, Camilla whispered urgently. Everything we've fought for and achieved together. No, Charles replied quietly but firmly. You destroyed it when you chose to hide the truth about who you are and what you've done. I'm just refusing to continue living the lie. As the last guests departed and the palace returned to its nighttime quiet, Charles stood alone in his study, looking out at the London skyline. Somewhere in the city, families were sleeping peacefully, trusting that their government and their future king would protect their interests and uphold justice. In 2 weeks, he would have to prove that their trust was justified. The decision he had made tonight would cost him his marriage, damage his reputation, and complicate his future reign in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But it would also allow him to look at himself in the mirror and know that he had chosen truth over convenience, justice over personal loyalty. For the first time since learning about Camilla's secrets, Charles felt at peace with himself. The hardest part was over. Now he just had to find the courage to follow through on the promises he had made. Down the corridor, in her private chambers, Camilla was making phone calls to people whose names would never appear in any official royal directory. The game was far from over, and she had resources that Charles couldn't imagine. But tonight, in the blue drawing room of Buckingham Palace, a future king had chosen the side of justice. Whatever happened next, that choice would define not just his reign, but his legacy as a man. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Clarence House as Charles sat in his private office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, financial records, and international correspondence. It had been exactly 2 weeks since his conversation with President Okafor, Today, he would fulfill his promise to address the crisis that had torn his world apart. The past 14 days had been a whirlwind of investigation, legal consultation, and painful family meetings. Charles had assembled a team of trusted advisors, including the palace's most senior legal counsel, international law experts, and crisis management specialists. Together, they had pieced together the complete scope of Camilla's family's arms-dealing activities and developed a comprehensive response plan. The evidence was even more damning than Charles had initially believed. Bank records showed that Camilla had personally authorized the transfer of over £50 million in illegal arms sales profits through various shell companies and fake charitable organizations. Photographs confirmed her attendance at meetings with known international arms dealers, including several who were later convicted of war crimes in international courts. Most devastating of all, military intelligence records revealed that weapons sold by Camilla's family network had been used in attacks that killed 37 British peacekeeping soldiers and over 2,000 civilians across multiple African conflicts. The blood money had funded Camilla's luxurious lifestyle for decades, including her ability to move in royal circles and maintain the social status that had originally attracted Charles. This morning, Charles would hold a press conference to announce his findings and his decisions. But first, he had one final conversation to complete. Camilla entered his office at precisely 9 o'clock, as they had arranged. She looked older than her 76 years, the strain of the past 2 weeks evident in her pale complexion and the shadows under her eyes. She wore a simple black dress and minimal jewelry, as if she were already in mourning for her royal life. "Good morning, Charles," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I assume you've made your decision." "I have," Charles replied, gesturing for her to sit in the chair across from his desk. "But before I announce anything publicly, I wanted to give you one final opportunity to respond to the evidence." Camilla settled into the chair with deliberate composure. "I've already told you everything I'm going to say about historical business matters. My position hasn't changed. Your position is that you bear no responsibility for the deaths of British soldiers who were killed by weapons you helped finance." Charles asked. "My position is that I conducted legal business transactions decades ago, and I refuse to be held accountable for every subsequent use of products that were sold in accordance with existing laws and regulations," Camilla replied. Charles studied his wife's face, searching for any sign of remorse or regret. He found only cold determination and wounded pride. "Camilla, in a few hours I'm going to hold a press conference where I will announce that I am requesting a formal investigation into your family's arms-dealing activities. I will also announce that you and I are separating immediately, and that you will be relinquishing all royal titles and patronages. You're ending our marriage over 30-year-old business dealings?" Camilla asked, her voice rising slightly. "I'm ending our marriage because you show no remorse for activities that resulted in the deaths of British soldiers," Charles replied. "I'm ending it because you've been lying to me about who you are for our entire relationship. And I'm ending it because you've made it clear that your personal comfort is more important to you than justice for the families of those who died." Camilla stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "You sanctimonious fool. Do you have any idea what you're destroying? Not just our marriage, but your own credibility as a future king. The British people will never forgive you for this public humiliation. The British people deserve to know that their monarchy stands for justice and accountability," Charles replied. "They deserve to know that I will not protect criminals, even when those criminals are members of my own family." "Criminals?" Camilla's voice was sharp with anger. "I conducted business activities that were legal at the time. If you want to talk about criminals, let's discuss some of the things your precious royal family has covered up over the years." Charles had been expecting this moment. Throughout their investigation, Camilla had made increasingly desperate threats about revealing other royal secrets if Charles proceeded with his plans. "What exactly are you threatening to reveal?" Charles asked calmly. "Your father's financial dealings with Middle Eastern arms dealers in the 1970s. Your brother Andrew's connections to international money laundering operations. Your own knowledge of palace cover-ups involving sexual assault allegations against multiple family members." Each accusation hit Charles like a physical blow, not because they were necessarily true, but because he knew that even unfounded allegations could cause enormous damage to the monarchy. "Are you saying these things are true, or are you simply threatening to make false accusations?" Charles asked. "I'm saying that if you destroy me publicly, I will ensure that every piece of potentially damaging information about the royal family finds its way to the international press," Camilla replied. "Accurate or not, The resulting scandal will make your arms-dealing revelations look like a minor footnote. Charles felt a wave of sadness wash over him. This woman, whom he had loved for decades, was now threatening to destroy the very institution they had both sworn to serve. Camilla, if you carry out those threats, you'll be destroying yourself as well. Any credibility you might retain will disappear completely. If you're determined to destroy me anyway, I have nothing left to lose, Camilla replied. But you do. You have a crown to inherit, a legacy to protect, and sons whose futures you're gambling with your moral crusade. The mention of William and Harry crystallized something in Charles's mind. His sons had both served in the military, had both risked their lives in service to their country. How could he protect a woman whose actions had contributed to the deaths of soldiers, just like them? My sons will be proud that their father chose justice over personal convenience, Charles said. And if the monarchy can't survive transparency and accountability, then perhaps it doesn't deserve to survive at all. Camilla stared at him for a long moment, and Charles saw the exact moment when she realized that her threats had failed. Her expression shifted from angry determination to cold calculation. You'll regret this decision for the rest of your life, she said quietly. But don't expect me to make it easy for you. After Camilla left, Charles spent 30 minutes alone in his office, preparing mentally for what was to come. In an hour, he would stand before the world's press and announce decisions that would change the course of his life and potentially the future of the British monarchy. At precisely 11 o'clock, Charles walked into the press room at Clarence House, where nearly 100 journalists from around the world had assembled. The room was unusually quiet, as if the assembled media sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. Charles took his position behind the podium, looking out at the sea of cameras and expectant faces. He wore a simple dark suit rather than any ceremonial dress, projecting an image of sober responsibility rather than royal pageantry. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles began, his voice clear and strong. I have asked you here today to address matters of historical importance that have recently come to my attention. He paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle over the room. 2 weeks ago, I was presented with evidence that members of my wife's family were involved in illegal arms dealing activities during the 1980s and 1990s. These activities contributed to conflicts that resulted in the deaths of British military personnel and thousands of civilians. The room erupted in a buzz of whispered conversations and the clicking of camera shutters. After conducting a thorough investigation with legal experts and international authorities, I have concluded that these allegations are substantiated by overwhelming evidence. The weapons sold by this network directly contributed to casualties among British peacekeeping forces and prolonged conflicts that caused immense human suffering. Charles paused again, allowing the implications to sink in. More troubling to me personally is the evidence that my wife, the Duchess of Cornwall, was personally involved in laundering the profits from these illegal sales. She participated knowingly in activities that put money in her family's accounts while British soldiers were dying from weapons that money had purchased. The buzz in the room grew louder, and Charles could see journalists frantically typing on their devices. Effective immediately, the Duchess of Cornwall and I are separating. She will be relinquishing all royal titles, patronages, and official duties. I have also requested that appropriate international authorities investigate her role in these activities with a view toward potential prosecution. Charles looked directly into the cameras as he delivered his next statement. I want to be clear that this decision was not made lightly. However, I believe that the integrity of the crown must take precedence over personal relationships. The British people deserve to know that their monarchy stands firmly on the side of justice and accountability, regardless of personal cost. He went on to announce the establishment of a compensation fund for the families of soldiers who had been killed by weapons linked to the arms dealing network, funded by the seizure of assets that could be traced to illegal arms sales. To the families of those who died, I offer not just compensation, but my personal commitment that their loved ones' sacrifices will be honored by ensuring that those responsible for their deaths are held accountable. The press conference continued for another 30 minutes, with Charles answering questions with remarkable candor and detail. When asked about the personal cost of his decision, he replied, "Some things are more important than personal happiness. Justice for those who died in service to their country is one of those things." As Charles left the press room, he knew that his life would never be the same. The headlines that would follow would be brutal, the public reaction would be mixed, and his future as king would be far more complicated than anyone had imagined. But as he walked through the corridors of Clarence House, Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with himself and his decisions. 6 months later, Charles stood in Westminster Abbey for his coronation as King Charles III. Camilla was not in attendance, having fled to a non-extradition country after international warrants were issued for her arrest. The ceremony was smaller and more subdued than originally planned, but it was attended by leaders from across the Commonwealth who had praised Charles's courage in choosing justice over personal loyalty. Kate stood with William and their children, representing the future of a monarchy that had chosen transparency and accountability over institutional protection. In her hands, she held a wreath that would be placed on the tomb of the unknown soldier after the ceremony, honoring all those who had died in service to their country. As the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the crown on Charles's head, the new king thought about the price of integrity and the weight of moral courage. He had lost his wife, endured months of brutal media coverage, and faced challenges to his authority that would continue for years to come. But he had also restored faith in an institution that many had written off as irrelevant and corrupt. He had shown that even a future king could choose justice over convenience, truth over comfort, and duty over personal desire. The crown on his head felt heavy, but his conscience was clear. In the end, that was the only thing that mattered.